Let's check in on some world events and see how the Truman administration is going to implement the strategy of containment on a world stage. During World War II, Greece split into a civil war that pitted royalists versus communists. In Turkey and Iran, there was also trouble, as the Soviets seemed to be trying to exert influence as well, in what Kennan called the subterranean plane in the long telegram. Covert, underground influence like spying, blackmail, and fomenting disruption. Meanwhile, Britain, still trying to recover from the war, was broke, and announced that they would no longer be able to provide financial assistance to the royalists in Greece, or to Iran, where they had significant oil interests and indirect colonial influence. The United States feared that the Soviets would then be able to exploit these situations, and remember how Turkey had long been a target of Russia after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople? They got their eye on that too. President Truman decided that the United States needed to step up to contain the Soviet Union by giving aid to the royalists in Greece and to Turkey. But that's great as an idea, I guess, but the president can't just whip out a checkbook and give that money away. He can't just, fly over and drop wads of cash. Congress controls the nation's purse strings, and with a Republican majority in the Senate and a Republican Speaker of House, despite the Democratic majority there, which kind of boggles my mind, the Congress was basically not the friendliest Congress that a president has ever had. On March 12, 1947, President Truman addressed a joint session of Congress to ask for $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey. That's a rather short speech, and it's also one of your documents. So again, read the whole thing. But I'm going to include some generous clips here. In the speech, Truman laid out the importance of this money to preserve not just Greece and Turkey, but world peace and freedom itself.
At the present moment, in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority, forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedom.
Truman's call for assistance with oversight formed the core of the Truman Doctrine, which can be shortly encapsulated in Truman's beliefs about the United States' role in world affairs following World War II.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. I believe that our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid, which is essential to economic stability and orderly political processes.
Truman took a specific issue of U.S. foreign policy and maximized it. The speech opened with the reasons why Greece and why Turkey needed financial assistance, but at the end of the speech really drove the importance of what was at stake. And this is kind of considered one of probably the most important policy speeches ever given by an American president. It might be the most important speech of Truman's career. And keep in mind, he'd been in office for less than 2 years by this point. Here's what's at stake.
The seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
Truman also reminded the Congress of their role in this fight by calling for cooperation between the legislative and executive branches.
Great responsibilities have been placed upon us by the swift movement of events. I am confident that the Congress will face these responsibilities squarely.
After about 2 months of debate, Congress passed the Aid to Greece and Turkey Act in May of 1947. Now, aid to Greece and Turkey was great, but they were not the only nation struggling in the post-war world. Economically speaking, Western European economies were stagnant and not doing well. That's why Britain had to pull their aid in the first place. People faced horrible shortages of basic foodstuffs, clothing, fuel, basic necessities for day-to-day life. Worse, France and Italy both had large communist parties that were active, fomenting strikes, protests, and general disorder. As officials in the State Department, and especially Secretary of State George Marshall, that same George Marshall from World War II, called for a large-scale plan for aid to jumpstart the European economy and help the United States economy at the same time. As remember, again, they don't want that industrial might from World War II to go away. Now, this is the second major part of containment in the Truman administration, the European Recovery Program, more commonly known as the Marshall Plan. Now, the Marshall Plan would provide economic assistance to basically anyone who wanted the aid. But again, they're not just going to write blank checks to anyone who asks. So here's how it works. Representatives of European nations met in July 1947 and put together detailed analyses of their needs, especially imports like foodstuffs. These countries didn't have money for fertilizer, wheat, steel, raw materials to get on their own feet, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, so to speak. The Marshall Plan created an international fund to provide these countries with the money to buy these things. Once the countries had the goods, they would then sell them to industrial producers, manufacturers, etc. So here's a bad example. France might sell wheat to industrial bakeries to produce pain, bread. The countries then take that money from selling the products and reinvest it in things like infrastructure to rebuild. Now, this is oversimplifying things, but that's the basic outline. Now, anyone could apply for this aid, even the Soviet Union, Poland, the Soviet sphere areas of Central and Eastern Europe, and some actually did ask for that assistance. Now, let's step back for a second. Let's think about this from a Soviet perspective. If you're Joseph Stalin and you've poured influence to make these Central and Eastern European nations go the way of communism, do you want them getting financial aid from the capitalist United States? Stalin basically flexed his muscle and made them stop asking because he didn't want them coming under American/capitalist influence because he was afraid this would be the beginnings of American economic imperial control. If nations are getting supplies from the United States, who are they not getting it from? The Soviet Union. Not that the USSR was really in a giving way, considering people were starving and how much of a monster Stalin was. I somehow have made it this far and not talked about how much of an evil person Stalin was. It's never seemed to have a place in the lecture, so I'll just say it here. Stalin was evil. He murdered more people than Hitler did. His purges of any dissidents or anyone who criticized his regime were well known, even if they were kept secret, which is why we'll probably never know exactly how many people he killed. As the Soviet Union was in the process of, spoiler alert, collapsing, a Soviet newspaper claimed that up to 20 million people were killed in these purges, which is almost as many Russians died in World War II. All right, so back to the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, combined with the aid to Greece and Turkey in the Truman Doctrine, was a milestone not only in the economic recovery of Europe, but also in the deterioration of U.S.-Soviet relations. And I think that's a pretty good stopping point for right now. In the next section, we're going to see how the Soviets responded to that American economic leadership.